There is a new thriller by American writer Dennis Lehane. People might know him because he wrote the book on which that wonderful film Mystic River, starring Sean Penn in what I think has been one of the best performances of his career. That came from a Dennis Lehane thriller, and he wrote a series of 5 books featuring a couple of private investigators, Pete Kenzie and Angie Gennaro, which I think are as good as anything that has been written in the genre. All of his books, most of his books, are set in and around Boston, and his latest is called Small Mercies, and it takes us back to the summer of 1974. There is a heat wave in Boston, and there is another kind of heat wave coming. It is time to implement the ruling of the Supreme Court, which is that schools must be racially mixed, so that there is going to be busing. Some white kids from this very, very exclusively white Catholic Irish neighborhood are going to be bused to a black part of Boston, and kids from the black part of Boston are going to come into this white Irish Catholic school. And that is causing an enormous amount of upset. And a teenage girl goes missing and then is found dead. And the story is of her indomitable mother, Mary Pat Fennessy, who is just a mother. She's a mother, and she was a wife until she kicked her husband out for philandering. And she survives, as many of the people like her do. They don't live in fancy houses. They don't have great jobs. They work 2 or 3 jobs at a time in order to get the money to survive and send their children to school. And she doesn't care who she takes on. She doesn't care what political wave she makes. She doesn't care that she walks onto the territory of the Irish mob, the kind of Irish mafia in control of Boston at the time. She wants the truth about how her daughter died and who did it. It's so powerful, both with this looming conflagration of the forced integration of schools and all the violence that attends her search to find the killer and the reason for the killing of her dead teenage daughter. I think it's absolutely fantastic. It's called Small Mercies. And then I started and then gave up on quite a few novels that aspired to be what one might call literary novels. So instead of a literary novel and a non-fiction, I have read and thoroughly enjoyed 2 non-fiction books. The first is called Fire Weather, a story from a hotter world, and it tells the story of the 2016 Fort McMurray wildfire in Alberta in Canada, one of the biggest blazes the world has ever seen. I mean, it transformed the local and not so local climate for up to 14 months before it was brought under control. And some of the descriptions of that fire, which John Vaillant, the author, has put together from eyewitness accounts and so on, it's quite extraordinary. It makes fire a living thing. And that's the area which is rich with bitumen in the sands, and roughly 40% of America's oil comes from transforming the bitumen in that part of Canada into oil, which then enters America. So it's about fire, what causes fire, the greater risks of fire that climate change poses, and we're seeing that in Canada again at the moment. We're seeing that around the world. But mostly it is about this fire, this living thing, which takes over the lives of the people affected by it. And it's also a story about some of the grey, grisly veterans who fought it and some of the people who were caught up in other ways in it. Just an extraordinary biography of a fire, if you like. Fire Weather, and the subtitle is A True Story from a Hotter World, and it is by John Vaillant, Vaillant. And then the latest biography of Martin Luther King by Jonathan Eig, E-I-G, who has written wonderful biographies of Muhammad Ali and Lou Gehrig recently, and now he turns his attention to Martin Luther King. And it is the first kind of serious attempt to understand Martin Luther King in more than 20 years. I haven't read the previous one, so I can't compare this to them, but it's a fabulous read. And it's not a hagiographic read. I mean, this goes into Martin Luther King's plagiarism. He was not an original thinker, and when he was doing his academic work, he would often borrow other people's studies and put them into his. It doesn't shy away from his his ignoring of his marriage vows on many, many, many occasions. But mostly it is the story of an extraordinary human being and how he divided America, how he collectivized a part of America, Montgomery, Alabama, I Have a Dream, his assassination. There's an enormous amount of rich and wonderful detail in this book, and I'm very glad that I read it and know a lot more about the complexity of the man who was born Mike King and whose father changed his name to Martin Luther after his father had been to Germany and had been impressed by the way they honored the great Protestant reformist. It's called The Life of Martin Luther King by Jonathan Eig, E-I-G.